It was a regular Saturday morning, the kind of quiet morning where the sun barely crept through the blinds and the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. I was fixing myself a cup, half awake, when I heard an unusual knock at the door. It wasn't the normal friendly tap of a neighbor, it was heavy, deliberate, and almost rehearsed. The kind of knock that demands attention. I set my mug down and glanced toward the door, already feeling the weight of trouble hanging in the air. Living in this HOA-controlled neighborhood had been a curse ever since we moved in. The so-called community association wasn't about keeping things nice, it was about control. And the one person at the center of it all was Karen. Our infamous HOA president, self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. She had fined us for our grass, for our trash bins, even for my Harley sitting in the driveway for a single night. She lived to make our lives miserable. But this was different. The knock carried authority, or at least the performance of it. I opened the blinds just slightly and saw two men standing there. They were dressed like police officers, black uniforms, shiny badges pinned to their chests. For a moment I thought maybe something serious had happened, but then my gut told me something was off. Their posture didn't scream real law enforcement, it screamed costume. One of them even had sunglasses on, though the sun hadn't fully risen yet. I opened the door just a crack and asked, "Can I help you?" The taller one stepped forward, flashing his badge so quickly I barely caught a glimpse. "We're responding to a violation report. You need to come with us for questioning," he said with this overly stern tone. "Violation report?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "For what exactly?" The shorter one chimed in. "Your motorcycle has been reported stolen. You're in possession of stolen property. We need to take a look." Right then I almost laughed. My Harley? Reported stolen? I had the title, the registration, the insurance all in my name. It was my pride and joy, a bike I'd rebuilt myself piece by piece. There was no way it was stolen. But what really struck me was their choice of words. Real cops don't usually phrase things like that. They don't come out accusing you right off the bat without evidence. They don't act like thugs at your doorstep. I leaned against the doorframe and said calmly, "Gentlemen, why don't you give me your names and badge numbers so I can verify who I'm talking to?" That's when the taller one's jaw clenched. He repeated louder this time, "Step outside. Now." Now here's the thing, I've dealt with real officers before, through work and through life, and real ones never behave like that. They're patient, they're professional. These guys? They were putting on a show, a performance they thought would scare me into compliance. I decided to play along just a little. I crossed my arms and asked, "Who sent you?" The shorter one smirked, and in that smirk I had my answer. "The Homeowners Association. They've escalated things. You're non-compliant. You're breaking rules, and now it's a criminal matter." My blood boiled instantly. Fake cops standing on my porch, sent by Karen and her HOA goons to intimidate me? This wasn't just petty fines anymore. This was harassment on a whole new level. But instead of reacting with anger, I smiled. Because I knew something they didn't. My wife at that exact moment was upstairs. And my wife wasn't just any woman. She was a federal agent, a badge-carrying, sworn officer of the United States. She had been in law enforcement for over a decade, and she knew every trick in the book. If these clowns thought they could intimidate us with costumes and fake authority, they were in for the shock of their lives. I called out casually, "Honey, can you come down here a sec? We've got visitors." The two fake cops exchanged a glance. The taller one leaned in toward me, lowering his voice, trying to reassert control. "This doesn't need to get messy. Just step outside, let us handle this quietly." I stepped back, leaving the door wide open. "No problem, I'll let my wife handle it." They straightened their shoulders, preparing for what they thought would be an easy scare tactic on both of us. But the sound of footsteps on the stairs changed the entire atmosphere. My wife walked down slowly, calm as ever, wearing her casual jeans and a plain t-shirt. Nothing about her screamed authority at first glance, until she clipped her badge to her waistband as she reached the bottom step. Her voice was steady, controlled, and icy. "Gentlemen," she said, approaching the door, "can I see your credentials?" The moment her badge caught the light, the color drained from their faces. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to threaten. Just the presence of that federal badge turned the entire game upside down. The taller one stammered, We were just responding to a report." "Funny," my wife interrupted, holding her badge out with one hand and pointing at them with the other. "Because I happen to know every law enforcement officer in this county, and I've never seen either of you. Care to explain?" The shorter one swallowed hard, his fake tough guy act collapsing. We might have gotten the wrong address." Oh really? She pressed, her eyes sharp like daggers. Wrong address, wrong uniforms, wrong story? Or was it the wrong plan altogether? Silence. Neither of them had anything to say. Then my wife took a step closer, her voice dropping into that dangerous, low tone I knew all too well. Impersonating a federal officer is a felony. Impersonating local police? Also a felony. You've got about 3 seconds to explain yourselves before I call this in, and trust me, you don't want to see what happens after that. The taller one's confidence finally broke. He muttered something under his breath, nudged his partner, and without another word, they turned and bolted down the driveway, practically tripping over themselves in the rush to get away. I watched them go, heart still pounding, half in disbelief and half in admiration for my wife. She stood there, cool as ice, watching them retreat like scared children. I shut the door slowly, locking it behind me, then turned to her with a grin. Well, I guess Karen thought she could scare us with Halloween costumes. My wife shook her head. She just escalated it too far. And now she's done. If she wants to play games with fake cops, I'll make sure the real ones knock on her door. At that moment, I knew the war with the HOA wasn't just about grass height or parking spaces anymore. Karen had crossed a line. And the battle that was coming? It was going to be bigger, louder, and far more dangerous than she ever anticipated. Because this time, it wasn't just me she was messing with. It was the law itself. And the law lived under my roof. After that morning at the door, the neighborhood felt different. You could taste it in the air, an odd mix of adrenaline and relief, like everyone had been holding their breath for years and finally exhaled. News travels fast in a cul-de-sac. Within an hour half the block knew what had happened. People came by with casseroles, coffee, offers to watch the kids, little ways of saying they were on our side. Some came just to give us a thumbs up, or to lean on our fence and whisper the same line that had been growing louder every day, finally. Karen, of course, didn't take the humiliation well. If anything, it made her nastier. The next morning her emails started, boxes of them, the sort of passive-aggressive tirades that used to get under people's skin until now. Community safety, bylaw enforcement, complaint escalation. She tried to package vindictiveness as duty, but she'd miscalculated. She thought a couple of fake uniforms and a little intimidation would silence me. She hadn't accounted for the fact that the woman who lived in our house didn't bluff, and she certainly hadn't accounted for the fact that the whole neighborhood was tired of being bullied. We waited quietly for the consequences. My wife said nothing dramatic. That wasn't her style. She simply got to work. She had a network she could call on, not for show but because she'd earned it over years in service. She made the necessary phone calls and filed the necessary reports. Impersonation of an officer is a serious crime, and when someone is bold enough to send imposters to intimidate a citizen, law enforcement takes it seriously. We gave the county detectives the names of the guys who showed up. We described their cars, their mannerisms, the exact words they used. We handed over photographs from our doorbell camera. We handed over the receipts for my Harley registration, insurance, everything to prove how absurd and malicious the whole stunt had been. Word went to the sheriff's department, who had already been on edge about Karen's complaints. They'd grown used to dismissing petty HOA noise and landscaping squabbles, but this was different. Fake cops on a private property at the request of an HOA? That was a line. The sheriff assigned a detective to look into it personally. He came by that afternoon, polite, professional, and quietly serious. We went through everything with him. He asked the right questions in the right way, the kind of attention that made us feel protected instead of targeted. The detective didn't make a show of it. He didn't roll lights or waggle badges. He took notes, collected evidence, and told us not to confront anyone. Let us handle the arrest, he said. We'll work through the legal front, you keep your distance. That calm authority soothed the neighborhood's nerves. People started talking to each other more openly now, swapping stories of fines and threats they'd quietly swallowed for years. When neighbors began to hand the detective their own records, screenshots of emails, copies of notices, bank statements showing HOA payments with no receipts, what emerged was bigger than just a single fake cop incident. It looked like a pattern. Karen doubled down on her online presence. She posted a sanctimonious notice on the HOA board and in the community Facebook group, accusing us of spreading lies and defaming a dedicated volunteer. She framed herself as a martyr. A couple of people, the ones who still benefited from her rule or were too afraid to stand up, chimed in defensively. But more and more folks posted their own evidence. One neighbor uploaded a video of Karen berating an elderly widow over a mailbox color. Another shared screenshots of fines issued without votes or proper documentation. People who had been silent for years started speaking. My wife's job put us in a weird position, both protected and conspicuous. Officers and detectives treated us with a professional distance that was respectful but matter-of-fact. The sheriff's detective made it very clear. If any threats were made, if anyone came close to our property again wearing uniforms, we were to call immediately. He also advised keeping a log of any interactions with the HOA and its members. Paper trail, he said. It'll be what corrodes them in the end. We followed his advice religiously. Every knock, every email, every suspicious car was recorded, dated, and filed. Karen's retaliation was predictable but petty. She started by targeting people she assumed were vulnerable, elderly folks, seasonal residents, sending threats of fines that read like ransom notes. Then she moved to more public acts. She called a special HOA board meeting and posted the flyers around the neighborhood with the same smug tone she'd used for years. Her flyer accused us of spreading fear, and declared a vote of no confidence in certain board members who had recently expressed sympathy for those who had been targeted. It was a clumsy attempt to regain control with bureaucracy. She sprinkled legal-sounding words like non-compliance and community standards in bold, hoping the ink alone would silence dissent. But the irony was sharp. She tried to force more people into a meeting, and the turnout was enormous. The crowd at the community center the night of the meeting was far larger than any HOA meeting I'd ever seen. People came because they were curious, restless, and yes, angry. There were faces in that room I hadn't seen at a single neighborhood barbecue in 5 years. Some had tears in their eyes, some stood stiff with anger. When the president of the HOA tried to call the meeting to order, she was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. This time, the victim wasn't the neighborhood. They were not the ones being policed. The victim was the community itself. We listened as people told stories one after the other. A father spoke about how his son had been fined for turning on holiday lights too early. A teacher read aloud an email she'd received calling her parenting negligent because her kids rode scooters on the sidewalk. Someone else described how Karen's son had spray-painted reserved on a public curb because he wanted to park closer to his house. The list was long, and the anecdotes painted a picture of a woman who used petty rules as armor and a weapon. By the time the sheriff's detective stepped to the podium, the mood had shifted from cathartic venting to organized action. He explained what residents needed to do to file complaints and preserve evidence. He talked about the impersonation incident, what it meant legally, how rare it was, and how seriously it would be taken. He stepped carefully through the next steps: subpoenas, witness statements, possibly criminal charges. He didn't promise instant results, but he promised investigation. That promise was enough for the room to erupt in quiet applause. While the legal wheels turned, Karen didn't sit idle. She tried other means. She spread rumors, began a smear campaign of her own. She claimed we were the ones stirring the pot for personal gain, inventing narratives that she hoped would fracture the growing unity. Her son became bolder in the face of mounting evidence. Maybe he thought his mother's bluster would shield him. He started parking his truck right in front of our driveway as a silent and stupid sabotage attempt. One afternoon he left a note under my windshield wiper that read, "Keep your bike locked up at night or it won't be there tomorrow." Threats had become overt. That note was a turning point. The sheriff's office responded swiftly. Surveillance was increased around the neighborhood. Officers began patrolling at different times, sometimes in plain clothes, sometimes in squad cars just to watch and record. My wife and I were careful about moving around the house. We always had our phone logs saved, the doorbell camera rolling, the garage closed when not in use. The detective advised not to engage with the provocations. "Don't give them fodder," he said. "Let them stumble on their own." Neighbors who had once been too timid to speak now walked openly to our house to show solidarity. Mrs. Ramirez from 2 houses down began leaving fresh-baked empanadas on our porch as an act of community support. The teenagers in the street who used to avoid eye contact at HOA meetings now waved as I left for a ride. A small but steady army of quiet, resolute faces formed around us. People who were no longer willing to trade their dignity for the illusion of perfection. The detective's investigation deepened. He subpoenaed HOA records and bank statements. The HOA had been collecting fines without proper accounting. There were transfers between accounts with no invoices or receipts. Fees had been assessed in the names of minor violations that didn't exist in any official bylaws. And worse, some of the fines had been pocketed or funneled into a side account with unclear beneficiaries. Little irregularities added up into something deliberate and sinister, a structure of petty extortion disguised as governance. When the subpoena arrived at the HOA office, the reaction was volatile. Karen's face went white when a process server handed the envelope to her at the community center. She tried, in a frantic whisper, to rally supporters, waving the specter of legal costs and association collapse, like a final threat. People who had before been swayed by fear now looked at her with skepticism. The lawyer she hired to defend the HOA was the kind you hire to deflect, to buy time, to muddy the water. He sent curt letters citing procedural technicalities and talking points about homeowners' rights and due process. It was classic delay tactics. But the detective's subpoenas were backed by the state's prosecutor. This wasn't about neighborhood dust-ups anymore. This was about potential criminal liability. The pressure built. Internal divisions within the HOA board came to light. Some members confessed in private meetings that they'd been coerced into signing off on certain fines. Others admitted they'd looked the other way because they feared being targeted next. The atmosphere inside the HOA was toxic. It was clear to anyone who had eyes that the house of cards was wobbling. Legal notices and police presence weren't the only consequences. Social consequences came hard and fast. Families who had stayed quiet for years now spoke at HOA meetings, demanding audits, demanding resignations, demanding transparency. The community elected a temporary review committee to oversee finances and bylaws. The change brought practical relief. Fines were suspended pending review, all pending enforcement actions were put on hold, and the board was temporarily dissolved pending the investigation. Karen didn't go quietly. She tried to spin a tale of persecution, telling anyone who would listen that we were a disruptive influence and that the sheriff's investigation was an overreach. She wrote angry letters to the local paper claiming bias and conspiracy. But the paper ran a balanced piece including quotes from neighbors and deputies. The truth, now documented and supported by records, didn't bend easily. Meanwhile, the men who had posed as officers were tracked down. They weren't policemen. They were petty opportunists who'd been hired by someone wanting to intimidate residents without leaving fingerprints. The detective found financial transactions, messages, and witness statements linking them to a small local private security group known for gray area tactics. The story unraveled quickly from there. The security group denied wrongdoing at first, then provided vague explanations that fell apart under scrutiny. One of the men turned state's witness and gave an affidavit detailing how the plan had been proposed by an HOA insider who'd wanted to teach a lesson, without publicly confronting homeowners. It didn't take long for fingers to point, and for the pattern of corruption to be traced back to several people in the HOA's inner circle. Emails were exposed. Bank transfers were traced. Testimonies piled up. The sheriff's detective compiled it all into a thick, damning packet and passed it along to the county prosecutor. That was the moment when the intimidation campaign truly cracked. The prosecutor filed charges: fraud, misappropriation of HOA funds, conspiracy to intimidate, and impersonation. For a long time the neighborhood had suffered under the threat of fines and petty harassment. Now those threats had legal consequences. The arrests were swift and public. People who had never imagined their quiet cul-de-sac making headlines watched as the process servers and patrol cars came in. Karen and two of her closest allies were taken into custody. Her son was questioned and released on bail, but with conditions: no contact with victims and no presence in the neighborhood. The crowd that gathered when they were led away wasn't vindictive. It was relieved and sober. For many, tears flowed. For others, there was a sense of closure, even if a small one. The court proceedings that followed were messy and public, full of depositions and cross-examinations. My wife testified, not as a hero but as a witness who had been targeted and knew what fear felt like. Neighbors came forward and recounted years of petty tyranny. The evidence was overwhelming: unauthorized fines, improper accounting, a culture of intimidation. While the legal drama played out, life in the neighborhood slowly began to mend. People who had been afraid to use their yards again hosted block parties. Children were allowed to play outside without the fear of a complaint from the porch. The HOA was restructured, led by people who actually wanted to serve the community. New bylaws were proposed with transparency measures: open books, public votes on fines, clear appeal processes, and independent oversight. The review committee facilitated workshops to help residents understand their rights and the proper functioning of an association. Trust had to be rebuilt, but it began. There were awkward moments. Some people felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. Some relationships that had been severed during Karen's reign needed careful tending. Reconciliation required time, apologies, and gestures of good faith. But the neighborhood spirit was mending, woven back together by a new sense of solidarity. And then there was the quiet aftermath for us. We went back to small things you don't notice until you almost forget what normal feels like: Sunday morning rides down empty roads with the wind on my face, dinner with friends on the patio, my wife returning late from work without a hitch. The incident at the door and the legal storm that followed had been disruptive and scary, but we were intact. We felt the community's gratitude not as an obligation but as a shared triumph. Still, there were lessons that stuck with us. We learned that courage can be quiet, that documentation matters, and that people who hide behind rules to bully others rarely survive scrutiny. We learned that sometimes change requires someone to stand up, not for spectacle but for the slow, steady work of truth. The sheriff's detective told us what he always tells people in these cases. Once you allow fear to govern a neighborhood, lawlessness grows in its shadow. Once you expose it, piece by piece, justice follows, not with fireworks but with hard paperwork and the steady ticking of due process. The story didn't end with a single courtroom victory. There were appeals, depositions, and the lingering awkwardness of neighbors adjusting to real oversight and accountability. But the core of it changed. The new HOA leaders opened meetings to all residents, and children took back the sidewalks. People who spent years avoiding eye contact began to chat over mailboxes. The place where fear had once reigned became, slowly, a community again. In the months that followed, my wife and I kept our lives as normal as we could. We continued to ride, to garden, to host neighbors. But we also kept files, copies of everything, emails, notices, photos. Not because we were paranoid but because we had learned the power of evidence. The sheriff's detective stopped by occasionally, not because anything new was happening, but to check in and to say, "Good job." That was the kind of praise you don't forget. One afternoon as I was tidying up the garage, I found an old sticker under a tool bench, a small, faded sticker from the first neighborhood get-together years ago. I held it for a second and then stuck it on the Harley's tank. A reminder, maybe, that the thing we defend isn't always a machine or a property. Sometimes it's the right to live without intimidation. The whole ordeal left scars on everyone, but it also left a community that had learned how to face down bad actors and insist on accountability. And the day the last legal paperwork was filed and the last of the fines were returned or voided, neighbors gathered for an impromptu barbecue in the common park. We ate, we laughed, and we watched our kids weave through feet and chairs, completely unconcerned about whether someone was tallying how long they'd been on the grass. That night, as the sun went down and the laughter faded into low conversation, my wife and I sat on the porch and listened. In the distance, a bike roared past, my bike, and someone in the street hollered a cheerful, "Nice ride." That small moment felt like a closure of sorts. Not a neat ending because real life rarely gives tidy endings, but a feeling that the neighborhood had reclaimed itself. Before we turned in, my wife smiled at me. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about the knocks on the door, the flashing lights that never came when we needed them, the fake policemen, the hearings, the subpoenas, the nights I spent worrying about neighbors' surgeries and who was going to feed pets when someone was arrested. I thought about the faces in the community center that night, the brave people who spoke up, the detective who listened, and the quiet courage my wife had shown at our front door. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm grateful." She nodded, tired but steady. "Me too." The war wasn't over. There would always be people who tried to seize power through petty rules or who would test the limits of decency. But for now, for this moment, the neighborhood had won a reprieve. For now, the children's laughter was louder than a clipboard's rustle and the rumble of a Harley was a sound that said we were free enough to enjoy it. And in the silence that followed, the house across the street that had once been a storm cloud seemed quieter, emptier. People said she tried to regroup elsewhere, that she moved out to a new development where she could start again. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that this place, this patch of street and row of houses where families lived and grew, would not be defined by one person's small tyrannies. It had been reclaimed. As for the men who had posed as officers, they faced charges and some took plea deals. The private security operation that had facilitated them faded under scrutiny. Some of its members were barred from certain types of work, sued by the state and publicly reprimanded. That was small justice, but it mattered. This part of the story, Part 2, closes with a community learning to walk again. It's a slow process, more like rebuilding a porch than erecting a monument. You lift one plank at a time, screw it down right, and don't rush the paint. But step by step, the neighborhood found its footing. The sheriff's office left behind a binder with contact numbers and advice. The new HOA bylaws hung in the community center, and kids went back to playing in the street without counting minutes. There's an ember that still smolders, less of anger now and more of resolve. People check each other's houses when someone's out of town. They warn one another about predatory contractors and shady services. They keep their documentation, their receipts, and their voices. Community meetings became spaces for care rather than control. The shared trauma that had almost broken the neighborhood had, if anything, brought people together. Life moved forward. There were quiet mornings and noisy afternoons, bad days and better ones. But the memory of those fake uniforms and the way they melted when my wife clipped on her badge served as a reminder. Appearance can be deceiving, but authority that rests on truth and law is heavier than any act. The law, when properly exercised and defended, protects people from those who would seek to exploit fear for personal gain. And when I rode my Harley past the park that week, a kid shouted, "Next time the cops better be real." I laughed and waved. In that laugh was the essence of what we had reclaimed: the right to live loud if we chose to, the right to walk our yards, to park our cars, to hang our lights, and, most importantly, the right to say no to bullies. The final scene of this part isn't dramatic. It's a backyard barbecue, the hiss of a grill, the soft clink of bottles, and neighbors passing bowls of potato salad. People who had once been cowed by a clipboard now admitted how scared they'd been, and then they spoke about small victories, the returned fines, the new bylaws, the neighborhood watch. It wasn't glory. It was a repair job. It wasn't swift, but it was steady. And it was enough. When the so-called fake cops sprinted off my porch the other night after realizing my wife was holding an actual federal badge, I thought maybe, just maybe, the HOA would finally back down. But I should have known better. People like Karen and her little gang don't quit easily. They get embarrassed, humiliated, and instead of admitting they're wrong, they double down. They want revenge, and they always think they're the smartest ones in the room. What they didn't realize, though, was that my wife and I weren't just going to defend ourselves anymore. We were going to go on the offensive. The very next morning, my wife was already awake before sunrise, sipping her coffee while scanning through some files on her laptop. She had pulled some strings and discovered that the so-called cops from the HOA weren't just random guys in uniforms. They were actually security contractors that Karen and a few board members had hired off the books. These weren't officers, not even mall cops. They were basically just private thugs paid to look official. That's why their badges looked so cheap under the porch light. They thought they could bluff their way into intimidating us, but once a real badge appeared, their little act fell apart. Now here's where it got interesting. The HOA had billed all of us homeowners for security services, in the last quarterly fees. It was written vaguely in the breakdown, enhanced neighborhood protection. But after digging deeper, my wife found invoices that clearly showed HOA money, our money, was being funneled to this shady contractor. That meant not only were they harassing us with fake cops, but they were also embezzling and misusing funds. My wife leaned back in her chair, looked at me and said, "This isn't just harassment anymore. This is fraud. This is federal." That one word, federal, changed the whole game. Suddenly, what started as Karen's little crusade about our fence and motorcycle had spiraled into a case that could land her and half the board in serious legal trouble. Later that day, I went outside to check the mail, and of course there she was, Karen. Standing across the street, arms crossed, glaring at me like she was some kind of neighborhood sheriff. She shouted, "Enjoy your little stunt last night? My people will be back, and next time that badge won't save you." I couldn't help but laugh. She actually thought my wife's badge was fake. She had no idea my wife had spent over 15 years in federal law enforcement. I looked at her calmly and said, "Karen, the only people coming back here are real agents, and they won't be knocking politely." The look on her face? Priceless. She scoffed, rolled her eyes, and stormed off toward her house, muttering something about how she runs this neighborhood. But what she didn't realize was that the walls were already closing in. 2 nights later, everything went down. Around 7 p.m., a couple of black SUVs rolled slowly into our street. Not Karen's fake cops this time, these were real government vehicles. My wife had quietly filed an official complaint and provided all the documents she dug up about the contractor payments. She hadn't told me when they'd show, only that I should be ready. I was sitting in the living room when I saw the flash of blue and red lights reflecting off the windows. I peeked outside and nearly burst out laughing. Karen was out on her front lawn, screaming at the agents as they calmly walked past her with folders and warrants in hand. "This is private property," she shrieked. "I'm the president of this HOA. You can't just barge in here." The lead agent didn't even flinch. He held up the warrant and said, "Ma'am, step aside. This entire HOA is now under federal investigation." And that was it. The neighborhood that Karen thought she ruled over had just been flipped upside down in front of everyone's eyes. Neighbors poured out onto their porches, whispering, watching, some even recording on their phones. Karen tried to argue, tried to threaten lawsuits, even tried to wave around a binder of HOA bylaws, like it meant something. But when 2 agents walked up to her with handcuffs, The entire street went dead silent. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for fraud, misuse of funds and impersonation of law enforcement," one agent said firmly. Karen's face drained of color. She stammered, You can't arrest me. I'm the president." And then came the line of the night. My wife stepped out of our house, badge on her belt, and walked right up to Karen. "No, Karen," she said calmly, "you were the president. As of right now, you're just another suspect." The whole block erupted. Some neighbors clapped, others cheered, and a few just stood there stunned. Karen's husband tried to protest, shouting about how this was all a mistake, but he ended up getting cuffed too for being part of the scheme. And remember those fake cops? Turns out they were already in custody, flipped on the HOA board, and gave the feds everything they needed. Watching Karen get shoved into the back of that SUV was surreal. For months she had been harassing us, fining us, threatening us, sending letters, even trying to break us down with her fake authority. But in the end, the only authority that mattered was my wife's badge and the real law behind it. The best part? The agents announced publicly that the HOA's accounts were frozen, the board was dissolved, and a receiver would be appointed to handle neighborhood matters until further notice. Translation: Karen's little kingdom was officially gone. Over the next week, the neighborhood transformed. People who had been too afraid to speak up suddenly came to our door thanking us. Turns out, Karen had been bullying everyone. Fines for flowers being the wrong color, threats for leaving trash cans out too long, even harassing an elderly couple over their Christmas lights. We weren't the only victims, we were just the first ones to push back. Now, months later, the neighborhood feels like a completely different place. The HOA is gone, the fraudsters are facing trial, and for the first time in years, people can actually relax in their own homes without worrying about Karen's clipboard of doom. Every now and then when I ride my Harley through the neighborhood, I catch people smiling, waving, and some even joking, "Better hide it before Karen comes back." We all laugh because now Karen isn't coming back. Not to this street, not to this HOA, not to this community. And as for my wife, let's just say she earned a new nickname around here. People don't call her by her first name anymore. They just call her the Badge. And everyone knows exactly what that means. In the end, Karen and her fake cops thought they could scare us with pretend authority. But the moment they came face to face with the real thing, they bolted. And the HOA? It crumbled faster than anyone could have imagined. That's the story of how one corrupt HOA tried to push too far, and how one federal badge ended it all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.